but for Eddie, it didn't come up to his standards, and so Bud didn't mind. He would get him another piece. Um, One of the other saddle makers may end up with that piece and using it and being fine with it. But for Eddie, it wasn't good enough. Eddie went on to, he left Ryan's and went to Elko, Nevada, and went to work for a well-known saddle shop out there. At this moment, I don't remember the name of the shop, but it was a very well-known shop, and eventually become the boss over the saddle shop out there. And I understand now that he's on his own and has got his own little shop building saddles just for him, his own customers. Wendy had a son. His name was Whistle, and that was his nickname, but that's the only name anybody knew was Whistle. That's what his dad and his mom, everybody called him Whistle. And Whistle was a character. He was a nice kid. He worked. I don't think he ever worked quite enough to suit his dad. His dad was always riding him. But Whistle was a good kid. His mom, Wendy's wife, I'm not sure I ever knew her first name, but she worked in the office, and Wendy was a calf roper, and he would go to rodeos a lot of times on the weekend and rope, but he had slowed down a lot by the time I knew him. When I went to work for Wendy, I was sitting in his office, and so we got to talking. He started asking me questions, and he said, "Would you be willing to go and learn how to cut leather?" And I said, "Sure." There was an older gentleman outside between Fort Worth, or between Lake Worth and Azle, and that was out Highway 199 goes northwest out of Fort Worth, goes through Lake Worth, Azle, on out to Springtown, and eventually out to Jacksboro, and out to West Texas. And there was a gentleman out between Lake Worth and Springtown, had a little bitty shop. By that time, he was semi-retired. He only built a few saddles, and he spent more time with his coon hounds chasing coons than he did in the saddle shop. But he was a friend of Wendy's, and I guess he had talked to him about somebody coming out there and him teaching him to cut leather, and not just the actual cutting of the leather, but picking out the areas in the hide that would work in certain parts of a saddle. You've got different parts that'll work out of different parts of the hide, and that is something if a saddle maker's going to cut his own saddle, he's got to know that. And so I'm not sure whether he thought he was fixing to lose Bud Johnson, or whether he wasn't satisfied with what Bud was doing. I don't know. But I agreed to do that, and he said, "Okay, I'll look into it." But he never got back with me, never said any more about it. So whatever his concern was, I guess it got fixed. I think that I worked for Wendy probably a couple of years. And again, I enjoyed working there. There was a lot going on. Uh, they had an older gentleman there repairing saddles just like they did at White's. He wasn't quite as colorful character as the guy at White's, but he was good at what he did. And I always remember when they bring a saddle in to clean it, well, they had a little room, looked like a little bathroom with a tub, bathtub in it, and they had a saddle rack made out of steel tubing. And he would take a saddle in there, had a concrete floor and a drain in the floor, and he'd hose this saddle down real good, get it good and wet, and he'd soap it and put saddle soap on it and get it good and clean and bring it out and let it dry. But that's the first time I'd saw anybody clean a saddle quite like that. But he did a real good job on them. He did a lot of repair work. He was good at repair work. As the shop, we did a lot of work for a lot of, not particularly the movie stars like White's did, but we did a lot of work for people that really used their saddles, the ranchers. Most of your cutting people, your cutting trainers, we made most of the saddles for them. Buster Welch, we made his first flat seat saddle. I believe that Bob Moline made that first one for him. At least that's what Bob says now. And others, Wendy's saddles, I don't know what, I really can't explain it, but all of the saddles that come out of Ryan's saddle shop had a certain look about them. You could just pick one out nearly anywhere. Here, a few years ago, I was at the Quarter Horse Congress, and I passed by this booth, and this saddle was sitting back in the back of the booth. And I stopped and was looking at it because it just looked familiar. And the guy, they were selling paintings in the booth, and the man that was there, he walked up and made some comment, and I said about the pictures. I said, well, I was looking at your saddle. He said, oh. He said, what about it? I said, well, it looks familiar. And I said, it's got to be made either by Price McLaughlin or it's a Ryan. And he grinned and looked at me and he said, well, it's a Price. And they're Price's saddles and Ryan's looked pretty close. Some of them you had to really look at to tell, which one was which. But all the Wendy's saddles, they just had a look about them. They were neat looking. They were smooth looking. I don't know. I really can't. I can come up with all kinds of words, but I'm not. I can't tell you exactly what I'm thinking about in them. They were good saddles. It didn't matter which one of the saddle makers made them that was working there. They all come out. They didn't look alike. They had different tooling and everything, but they still had that Wendy Ryan look on them. Wendy told us one time, he said, I can't tell you how to build a saddle, but he said, I can tell you if it's right or not. And he meant it. He could. He'd be looking at them on the floor or something, and down on the sales floor, and he'd come up, he'd go, if he found something he didn't quite like, well, he would go and look up and see who made it and come and talk to them and said, let's do something about this. And of course, you had no choice. You had to do it. Wendy had a habit of talking. When he was talking to a customer, he'd sit on the saddle and he'd talking, and he'd get his hands on the horn and he'd move his hands around and be pushing on it. And back then we had horn cap. We put horn caps on nearly everything, and they were put on with a single wood screw. And we put them in and tighten them up, and he would work them loose, not even realizing what he was doing. He would send them back, and we'd have to fix them. And so finally, Bud decided we was going to fix it. So he went and bought some glue, something like super glue. And so we started putting those in the hole before we run the screw down in it to put the cap on. And that held it. Wendy didn't get any more done. One time we had a motor, electric motor with a wheel on it, and we sharpened our knives with it. And Wendy come down there one day with his pocket knife, and he was going to sharpen his pocket knife, and he happened to turn the blade the wrong direction, and the wheel caught it and slung it across the shop and stuck in the wall on the other side. He didn't say a word. He just went over and got his knife, stuck it in his pocket, and walked out. And I don't think he ever come up there to try to sharpen his knife again. But there was nothing ever said about it. And he was a good guy to be around, a good guy to work with. Another funny incident happened at Ryan's. One winter, this is before I went to work there, and it was before Bud Johnson was shop foreman. The heat went out, and this is in the winter time, and it got pretty cold in that old building upstairs. So they worked one day without the heat. Next day they come in to work and there's still no heat. And they worked a while, and finally the foreman hollered at everybody, says, y'all come with me. So they went back in the storeroom, stock room, dug out some down coats. And the foreman, he started taking them out of the box and handing them out. So everybody got them a down coat. And they went back to work. And an hour or so later, Wendy come up for something. And he said, what in the world is going on? And the foreman told him, says, we can't work in the cold. Says, we don't have any heat. Wendy didn't say a word. Turned around and walked back downstairs, and about I think they said 3 or 4 hours later, there was somebody there to fix the heat for them, and they put their down coat, brand new down coats, back in the box. After Bud Johnson become the shop foreman, they decided they needed a clicker to click out parts and speed things up a little bit. And there were some things that they could click out that they could still do good hand work, but it would just save them some time. The fenders, and the stirrup leathers, and things that didn't have to be fitted, they could click out. They could click out the breast collars and head stalls and stuff like that. So they bought this huge what they call a double arm clicker. It had two heads and they were, each head was about that long and about that wide, and they swung out like that. They were pivoted on the outside, and they come back in together like that and formed one huge clicking, pressure giving plate. And well, no way they could come up the stairs with it, even if they had the manpower to bring it up. That thing was about 8 foot long and maybe 4 foot wide, and probably, well, it was taller than me, so it was over 6 foot tall. So the only way they could get it in the shop was to knock a hole in the wall. They took a window out and enlarged the hole, and brought in a big old crane that picked it up off of the truck and set it on inside the building on the floor on rollers, and they rolled it over to where they wanted it, got it set in position, and got it all hooked up, ready to go. Well, they picked out something and they clicked it, and when you click it, well, of course, it wasn't a hydraulic. A hydraulic just goes down and penetrates the leather and cuts it. But this was what they call a mechanical. So it was all of a sudden, when you hit the trigger, it was all of a sudden, and it went kaboom, and it would shake. And they started getting calls from downstairs and wanted to know what was going on. The ceiling was falling in, and it knocked plaster, sheetrock off of the ceiling down into the retail store. And so they had to do something about that. And they put some shock absorbing feet under it, and finally got it to where they could operate it without tearing the building apart. Another man that Wendy had working for him, saddle maker, I hadn't mentioned. His name was George Murray. Wendy had him a little bench sitting down in the retail store, and George, his job was to be a goodwill ambassador. George had lived around the Fort Worth, Jacksboro, that part of the country all of his life. He knew everybody in the country. As far as if they had horses or cattle, he knew them. And so Wendy figured that he was a good person to have down there just to meet the people and talk to them. And he built saddles down there. Good saddle maker. He'd been a saddle maker years and years and years. I believe that Wendy had him on a salary, plus he paid him so much every time he finished a saddle. So it didn't bother Wendy if George stopped and talked a while, and it didn't bother George's paycheck if he did stop and spend some time, because if he wasn't working on the saddle, then he was getting paid by the hour some too. So George was good with people. A lot of times a saddle customer would go and talk to George and talk to him about what he needed or what he wanted, and then he would place an order for a saddle that maybe George didn't even make. They would make it upstairs. George's saddles were somewhat higher than the other saddles made in the shop. George was a real nice person. I didn't get to know him very much, but just, you know, passing through the store and stopping and talking occasionally. But he'd been there a long time. I think that he might have been there when they opened the store. But I believe Wendy did a good thing. I think it paid Wendy to have him down there. Years later, in fact, only a couple of years ago, I met this young man. Well, let me back up a little bit. Wendy, his son Whistle, had a son, and Sean. And now Sean has a saddle shop on the north side. He's been coming to the Congress, Quarter Horse Congress in Columbus, Ohio for seemed like 3 or 4 years, and evidently he's doing pretty good. He's got the Ryan name behind him, of course, and that doesn't hurt him any. And he carries on, carrying on Wendy's tradition of having top-notch merchandise. He has handmade boots and handmade saddles, and then the other stuff that goes with it. So to continue my story, I was in Sean's booth at the Congress a couple of years ago, and just looking. I always go in and look everywhere, every shop, every booth that's got saddles. I always go in and look around, and if there's anybody around, I'll talk. And so this young man walked up to me, and we got to talking, and come find out, it was George Murray's grandson, and he was making saddles now for Sean Ryan. And I don't believe that it'd been, well, he wasn't old enough to have been doing it a long time, but evidently he'd been doing it enough, and he'd learned enough that Sean thought he was all right to make his saddles. So that was interesting. I really enjoyed talking to him, being George's grandson. So kind of makes me feel like I might be getting up in years